The greatest threat to the survival of Saigon in April 1975 was not the North Vietnamese army. It was the American ambassador. Graham Martin spent the final days of the war fighting his own rescuers. He believed he was saving American honor. In reality, he was ensuring its ultimate humiliation. It was April 1975. Outside the gates, 16 enemy divisions were tightening the noose. The CIA begged him to burn the top-secret files. The pilots begged him to cut down the tree blocking the escape route. But Martin just sat in his freezing office, lighting another cigarette, paralyzed by a delusion that would doom thousands. He sacrificed the living to protect his own pride. But the chaos on that roof, the famous photos of the desperate scramble, don't be fooled. That nightmare was just the beginning. A great tamarind tree stood in the center of the embassy courtyard. Massive, ancient, its trunk seemed as solid as the American resolve it was meant to symbolize. Its branches spread wide, casting a cool, dappled shadow over the parking lot where the diplomat's limousine sat idling. For the final agonizing months of the Republic of Vietnam, this tree was not merely a piece of landscaping. It became the psychological anchor of one man's delusion. It was the physical manifestation of a refusal to accept reality. The military attachés, the pragmatists, and the pilots looked at that tree and saw a lethal obstruction. They knew the end was approaching. They knew that once the runways of Tan Son Nhut were cratered by artillery, only the heavy-lifting helicopters, the Jolly Green Giants, could save them. Those leviathans needed space. They needed the tree gone. Graham Anderson Martin, the man in the ambassador's office, would not hear of it. Cutting down the tree meant admitting the helicopters were coming. Admitting the helicopters were coming meant admitting the United States was leaving. And Graham Martin, a man carved from the granite of the Old South, a cold warrior of the purest and most stubborn vintage, did not believe in leaving. He believed in winning. Even as the horizon turned purple with the smoke of burning villages, and as the intelligence reports stacked on his desk screamed of an approaching apocalypse, Martin stood sentry over that tree. He protected it as if the integrity of the South Vietnamese government was held together by its bark. This story moves beyond military tactics. The generals had long since lost control of the narrative. This narrative explores the architecture of denial. It is an autopsy of a specific kind of American hubris, the kind that does not roar but whispers. It traces the steps of a man sleepwalking through a burning building, locking the doors to keep the smoke out, while thousands of people, spies, secretaries, translators, allies, waited in the hallways, trusting him to hold the keys to their salvation. April 1975 became a carnival of betrayal. The roots of this disaster stretch back to the ghost haunting the office of the ambassador. The silence of Graham Martin requires explanation. Martin arrived in Saigon in the summer of 1973. The war was supposed to be over, or at least the American dying was supposed to be over. The Paris Peace Accords had been signed. Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho had shaken hands in a sterile room in France, agreeing to a ceasefire that British observers, with their centuries of cynical diplomatic experience, immediately recognized as a farce. It was a decent interval, a cynical pause designed to allow the United States to withdraw with a shred of dignity before the inevitable collapse. Martin did not view it as a pause. He viewed it as a new beginning. He was 61 years old, but he appeared much older. He was physically eroding before the eyes of his staff. A chronic hacking cough plagued him, the result of a lifetime of chain smoking. His voice was often no more than a rasping whisper, forcing people to lean in close to hear him, a dynamic that added to his aura of secretive authority. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over the bones of his face. Behind his thick, black-rimmed glasses, his eyes burned with a feverish intensity. The State Department knew him as a hardliner's hardliner, a man who had served in Italy and Thailand, a man who despised the press with a visceral, almost pathological intensity. He viewed journalists not as observers, but as saboteurs, defeatists, who had poisoned the American will to fight. Something else drove Graham Martin, something absent from his personnel file. A grief so profound it had calcified into obsession fueled him. Years before he stepped foot in the Saigon embassy as ambassador, the war had already taken everything from him. His adopted son, First Lieutenant Glenn Martin, had been a helicopter pilot, a young man of promise, of life. Glenn had been killed in combat in Vietnam in 1965. He died in the very jungles his father was now sent to oversee. Here lies the psychological smoking gun. For Graham Martin, the Vietnam War was not a matter of domino theories or geopolitical containment. It was a blood feud. It was personal. Every inch of South Vietnam became sacred ground because it had drunk the blood of his son. Accepting that South Vietnam was doomed, or accepting that the American project was a failure, meant accepting that Glenn Martin had died for nothing. It meant looking at his son's grave and saying, it was a waste. Graham Martin was incapable of uttering that sentence. His mind, brilliant and disciplined as it was, recoiled from that truth. It built a fortress against it. Upon landing in Saigon, he did not act like a man overseeing a withdrawal. He acted like a viceroy sent to resurrect an empire. He treated the Paris Peace Accords not as a retreat, but as a framework for a permanent standoff, a Korean-style division that would preserve the South forever. He looked at President Nguyen Van Thieu, the leader of South Vietnam, and saw not a corrupt dictator losing his grip, but a misunderstood statesman who simply needed more money, more time, and more faith. The atmosphere in the embassy changed the moment Martin took charge. His predecessor, Ellsworth Bunker, had been a patrician figure, distant but realistic. Martin was different. He micromanaged reality. He began to curate the information flowing to Washington. The cables leaving the embassy under his signature became masterpieces of obfuscation. Bad news was softened. Defeats were framed as temporary setbacks. Corruption was described as growing pains. He resembled a doctor refusing to diagnose terminal cancer, insisting instead that the patient merely had a severe flu curable with a better attitude. The strange, suspended animation of Saigon in 1974 aided this delusion. The American combat troops were gone. The bars on Tudu Street were quieter. The massive military machine had packed up its tents. But the money still flowed, albeit in smaller streams. The CIA station remained the largest in the world. The contractors stayed. A sense of normalcy existed, but it was the brittle normalcy of a glass vase sitting on the edge of a vibrating table. Martin immersed himself in the minutiae of the job. He obsessed over the embassy's image. He fought battles not with the Viet Cong, but with the New York Times and the Washington Post. He spent hours composing vitriolic cables, attacking reporters who dared to suggest that the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, was hollow. He saw enemies everywhere, in the halls of Congress, in the editorial pages, even among his own staff. Anyone who questioned the viability of South Vietnam was branded a traitor to the cause. While Martin fought his war of words in the air-conditioned offices of Saigon, the real war shifted in the countryside. The North Vietnamese, patient and relentless, watched. They saw the American Congress cutting aid. They saw the Watergate scandal consuming the Nixon presidency, paralyzing the executive branch. They smelled weakness. They began to build roads, not jungle trails, but highways, great paved arteries cut through the mountains and the rainforests, down the spine of the country. They moved tanks, heavy artillery, and surface-to-air missiles into position. They were building a conventional army for a conventional conquest. The intelligence analysts at the embassy saw this. The young officers, the field agents who spent their days in the dusty provinces, saw the buildup. They took photographs. They interviewed defectors. They wrote reports warning that the peace was a fiction, that a massive offensive was preparing. These reports traveled up the chain of command from the field desks to the station chiefs, finally arriving at the polished mahogany desk of the ambassador. And there they died. Martin would read them, his face impassive, smoke curling from his cigarette. Then he would file them away or send them back with notes demanding more verification. He created a culture of silence. People learned that bringing bad news to the ambassador meant ending one's career. Staying silent was safer. Talking about the weather or the new shipment of French wine at the commissary was safer. The tragedy of the sleepwalker is not just that he is asleep. It is that he forces everyone around him to tiptoe. As 1974 bled into 1975, the signs became impossible to ignore. The North Vietnamese tested the waters. They attacked Phuoc Long province, a remote area, but strategically significant. The South Vietnamese army fought, but they were outgunned and outmaneuvered. They called for air support, but there were no American B-52s darkening the sky anymore. The phone line to Washington rang, but nobody answered with the force that was needed. Phuoc Long fell. It was the first time an entire province had been lost since 1972. It was a shockwave. In Hanoi, the communist leadership waited. They held their breath, expecting the wrath of the United States to descend. They expected the bombers to return. Nothing happened. Congress was tired. The American public was tired. President Ford, holding the reins of a broken presidency, could do little more than issue a statement of protest. To any rational observer, this was the signal. The guarantee of American protection was dead. The domino was wobbling. But Graham Martin interpreted it differently. He rationalized it. He told his staff that Phuoc Long was unimportant, a useless piece of jungle that the South was better off without. He argued that this would actually strengthen Thieu's position by shortening his defensive lines. He spun the defeat until it looked, to his tired eyes, like a tactical readjustment. He began to spend more time alone in the embassy residence. He was suffering from severe bronchial pneumonia. He coughed up blood. His weight dropped further. He looked like a specter haunting his own life. Yet, he refused to leave his post for medical treatment. He felt that if he left even for a week, the house of cards would collapse. He was the indispensable man. Imagine him in those nights, wandering the halls of the residence, looking at the photographs of his son. The father who could not save his boy was determined to save the country that killed him. It was a noble sentiment, perhaps, in a Greek tragedy. But in the realm of geopolitics, it was a recipe for slaughter. The CIA station chief, Thomas Polgar, a Hungarian-born intellectual with a sharp mind and a survivor's instinct, began to feel the cold wind of catastrophe. Polgar had seen societies collapse before. He knew the smell of it. He began to gently press Martin. He urged the ambassador to consider the non-essential personnel, the thousands of American civilians, and the tens of thousands of Vietnamese employees. Martin would cut him off. He insisted that the worst would not happen. He believed Hanoi knew a military victory was impossible. He believed they wanted a coalition, a seat at the table. He was convinced they wouldn't risk destroying the capital. Martin clung to the idea of a third force, a political solution where the South would be governed by a coalition of neutralists, communists, and nationalists. It was a fantasy that had been dead for years, but Martin resurrected it because it was the only scenario that allowed for American honor to remain intact. He believed he could negotiate his way out of the path of a tank. And so, the plans for evacuation remained drafted on paper, locked in safes, theoretical and undrilled. The tamarind tree continued to grow in the courtyard, its roots digging deep into the soil, its branches reaching for the sky, oblivious to the fact that it was marking the X on the map where the final humiliation would take place. The stage was set. The actors were in place. The blindfold was securely tied around the eyes of the man in charge. And to the north, the engines of the T-54 tanks were roaring to life, ready to roll down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and shatter the silence of the ambassador's dream. The long, slow slide into the abyss had begun, but the fall, when it came, would be faster and more violent than anyone, even the most pessimistic prophets of doom, could have imagined. The silence of the Central Highlands broke not with a whisper, but with a geological rupture. It was March 1975, and the coffee plantations of Ban Me Thuot, usually smelling of damp earth and Robusta beans, began to smell of cordite and diesel. The North Vietnamese army had not just infiltrated the region, they had saturated it. General Van Tien Dung, the architect of the final offensive, had moved entire divisions through the jungle canopy with a stealth that baffled American intelligence. They were ghosts until they opened fire, and when they did, the war transformed instantly from a stalemate into a slaughter. Ban Me Thuot fell in days. It was a stunning, decisive blow that cracked the spine of South Vietnam. The ARVN defenders were not just defeated, they were evaporated. And in the presidential palace in Saigon, Nguyen Van Thieu, a man prone to paranoia and now gripped by panic, made the decision that would seal the fate of his nation. He looked at the map, saw the red arrows of the communist advance, and ordered a retreat. He called it lighten the top, keep the bottom. The plan was to abandon the highlands, withdraw the best troops to the coastal enclaves, and regroup for a final stand around Saigon and the Mekong Delta. On paper, in a military academy classroom, it might have made sense. In the reality of a war-torn country with fragile morale and a terrified civilian population, it was a death sentence. The withdrawal from the highlands turned into the convoy of tears. This was not a military maneuver. It was a migration of sorrow. Soldiers abandoned their posts to find their families. Officers commandeered trucks for their furniture while leaving the wounded behind. A river of humanity. Tens of thousands of troops mixed with hundreds of thousands of civilians poured onto Highway 7B, a neglected, cratered road that led to the coast. It was here that the war showed its true face. The North Vietnamese artillery zeroed in on the exposed column. They shelled the trucks, they shelled the buses, they shelled the ox carts. The road became a slaughterhouse. There was nowhere to run. The jungle on either side was mined or teeming with ambush squads. The footage from those days is the stuff of nightmares. Children wandering alone amidst burning jeeps, soldiers clinging to the skids of overcrowding helicopters, the sheer animalistic desperation of survival. The strategic withdrawal had become a rout. The South Vietnamese army didn't just lose territory, they lost their soul on Highway 7B. Back in Saigon, the air conditioning in the U.S. Embassy hummed its monotonous, soothing rhythm. Graham Martin read the reports of the disaster in the highlands. He saw the maps changing color, and yet his reaction was one of baffling, almost extraterrestrial calm. He did not see an avalanche. He saw consolidation. He messaged Washington, arguing that Thew's decision was actually a stroke of genius. By shortening his lines, Martin argued the South was becoming leaner and tougher. He compared the catastrophic rout to a chess player sacrificing a pawn to save the king. He refused to use the word collapse. In his cables to Henry Kissinger, he wrote with the confidence of a man who was watching a completely different war. He insisted that the ARVN was tactically intact and that the North Vietnamese were overextending themselves. This was the Martin filter at its most dangerous. He was scrubbing the blood off the news before sending it to the White House. He believed that if he admitted the severity of the defeat, Congress would cut the final lifeline of aid. So he lied. He lied to save the aid, hoping the aid would save the country. But the country was already dead. It just hadn't hit the ground yet. The horror moved north. Hue, the ancient imperial capital, the city of kings, fell with barely a fight. The psychological contagion of the highlands had spread. Soldiers simply dropped their rifles and melted into the crowds. Then came Da Nang. Da Nang was the second largest city in South Vietnam. It was supposed to be a fortress. It was flooded with 1 million refugees fleeing the north. The city became a pressure cooker of panic. When the first mortar rounds hit the airport, the social order disintegrated. The World Airways flight, the last plane out of Da Nang, remains one of the most harrowing scenes in aviation history. The Boeing 727 taxied down a runway that was being overrun by a mob. It wasn't women and children boarding. It was soldiers. Terrified, armed men from the ARVN elite Black Panther Division forced their way onto the plane, shoving civilians aside, trampling the weak. They jammed into the wheel wells. They clung to the stairs. As the pilot pulled the nose up, men fell from the landing gear, plummeting thousands of feet to their deaths. The plane landed in Saigon hours later with blood smeared over the flaps and body parts jammed in the undercarriage. Graham Martin went to Tan Son Nhut to see the plane. He looked at the blood. He looked at the traumatized crew. And still, the denial held. He reportedly told an aide that the stories of chaos in Da Nang were exaggerated by the press. He attributed the collapse not to the enemy's strength, but to a temporary panic caused by liberal journalists spreading fear. By early April, the North Vietnamese army controlled 2/3 of the country. They were moving faster than they had ever dreamed possible. General Dung had tossed his original timetable into the fire. He had planned for a 2-year campaign. Now he realized he could take Saigon before the monsoon rains arrived in May. He gave the order, Ho Chi Minh Campaign. The objective was total victory. Inside the embassy, the atmosphere became schizophrenic. The junior officers, the CIA analyst, and the military attachés were now working in a state of suppressed hysteria. They knew the end was weeks, perhaps days, away. They began to secretly shred documents. They began to reach out to their Vietnamese contacts, whispering warnings. Get your papers ready. Get some gold. Be ready to move. But they had to do it in the shadows. Martin had issued a standing order. No talk of evacuation, no defeatism. He threatened to fire anyone caught spreading gloom and doom. He was like a captain on the Titanic forbidding the crew from lowering the lifeboats because it might alarm the passengers in first class. He spent his days lobbying for a $700 million emergency aid package from Congress. He believed, with a religious fervor, that this money would turn the tide. He truly thought that dollars could stop tanks. He sent cables to Washington that were increasingly erratic, rambling for pages about his own brilliance, attacking his critics, and promising that the South could still win if America just kept the checkbook open. At night, the lights in the embassy stayed on. Martin would sit in his office. the smoke from his cigarettes forming a blue haze around him. He was waiting. He was waiting for the third force to emerge. He was waiting for the communists to stop their advance and ask for a meeting. He was waiting for a rational world that no longer existed. Outside the embassy gates, the city of Saigon was holding its breath. The bars were emptying. The black market for U.S. dollars was exploding. Everyone knew. The trishaw drivers knew. The bar girls knew. The street urchins knew. The Americans were leaving. The giant metal birds were going to fly away, and the red tide was going to wash in. But the man with the power to save them, the man who controlled the airlift, the man who held the lists of names, sat in his office and stared at the map, willing the red arrows to stop. He was fighting a war against reality, and reality was about to crash through the gates with the force of a T-54 tank. The sleepwalker was still dreaming, but the fire was now licking at the hem of his trousers. April 1975 arrived not with a whimper, but with the screech of metal tearing against the earth. If March was the month of military collapse, April was the month of moral vertigo. The North Vietnamese army had swallowed the country whole. The long, thin shape of Vietnam, once divided into tactical zones and corps, was now a solid block of communist control, save for a shrinking enclave around Saigon. The capital city had become an island, cut off by road, surrounded by an iron ring of divisions that were tightening their grip by the hour. Graham Martin needed a victory. He needed something, anything, to show the American Congress that the cause was moral, that the South Vietnamese people were worth saving. He found his answer in the eyes of children. Operation Baby Lift was conceived as a humanitarian gesture, a mass evacuation of orphans, many of them the mixed-race children of American GIs, to adoptive homes in the West. It was intended to tug at the heartstrings of the world. Martin threw his full weight behind it. He believed that images of smiling nurses carrying babies onto American jets would shame Congress into passing the $700 million aid package he was so desperate for. But the war had no room for mercy, and it had even less room for public relations stunts. On April 4th, the first flight of Operation Baby Lift, a massive C-5 Galaxy transport plane, took off from Tan Son Nhut. It was packed with over 300 people, including infants, children, and female embassy staff. Minutes after takeoff, the rear cargo door blew out. The giant plane suffered rapid decompression. The pilot struggled to control the Leviathan as it banked sharply and slammed into a rice paddy near the Saigon River. The fuselage broke into pieces. The lower cargo deck was crushed. Over 130 people died, including 78 children. The disaster was a gruesome omen. The sight of the wreckage, the tiny bodies scattered in the mud, should have been the final wake-up call. It was a message written in blood. There is no safe exit. The time for gestures is over. Graham Martin, however, did not see an omen. He saw a tragedy, yes, but he also saw a logistical setback. He kept pushing. He kept arguing. He blamed the maintenance crews. He blamed bad luck. He did not blame the fact that he was trying to run a humanitarian corridor through the middle of a collapsing war zone. Inside the embassy compound, the air grew thick with a specific kind of dread, the dread of knowing the truth, but being forbidden to speak it. The CIA station chief, Thomas Polgar, was now in open, albeit quiet, rebellion against the ambassador's paralysis. Polgar sat in his office surrounded by shredders that were already humming. He knew what was coming. He had lists. Every intelligence officer had them. Lists of Vietnamese spies, lists of counterterrorism police, lists of translators who had interrogated Viet Cong prisoners, lists of secretaries who typed the names of communist agents. These were the high-risk indigenous personnel. If the North took Saigon, these people would not merely be unemployed. They would be hunted. They would face execution walls or the slow death of the re-education camps into which thousands would eventually disappear. Polgar approached Martin repeatedly. The conversations were tense. "We must start moving the Vietnamese," Polgar urged. "We have the C-141s flying in with supplies. They are leaving empty. Let us fill them with our people." Martin's refusal was absolute. "No," he said. "If we start moving large numbers of Vietnamese, the population will panic. The army will disintegrate. Thieu's government will fall. I will not trigger the collapse." This was the ambassador's trap. He believed that preparing for failure would cause the failure, so he chose not to prepare at all. The C-141 transports continued to leave Tan Son Nhat, rising into the humid sky, their cargo holds vast, cavernous, and empty. Below them, thousands of people who had bet their lives on American loyalty were being unknowingly condemned to stay. Martin's reliance on the third force delusion deepened. He was receiving backchannel signals, whispers from French diplomats and Hungarian intermediaries, suggesting that the communists might stop at the gates of Saigon. They suggested a negotiated surrender might be possible if President Thieu resigned. Martin grabbed onto these whispers like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. He convinced himself that he could broker a political masterpiece. While Martin played diplomat, the soldiers of the South Vietnamese army prepared to die. At Xuan Loc, a provincial capital 40 miles east of Saigon, the final battle began. The ARVN 18th Division, commanded by General Le Minh Dao, dug in. They were outnumbered 3-1. They had no air support to speak of, but for 12 days they fought with a ferocity that stunned the North Vietnamese. They held the line. They destroyed tanks. They fought hand to hand and in the rubble. Martin used Xuan Loc as proof. "See," he told Washington, "they are fighting. They can hold. We just need to send them the money." But Xuan Loc was not a turning point. It was a tombstone. The North Vietnamese simply poured more divisions into the fight. They ground the 18th Division into dust with artillery. On April 21st, Xuan Loc fell. The road to Saigon was wide open. There were no more armies standing between General Dung's tanks and the presidential palace. That same day, President Nguyen Van Thieu resigned. In a tearful, bitter speech televised to the nation, he accused the United States of betrayal. "You have run away and left us to do the job that you could not do," he said. It was a stinging indictment. Thieu fled to Taiwan days later, his luggage filled with gold, leaving his people behind. Martin felt a strange sense of vindication with Thieu's resignation. He believed this was the key. Now surely the North would negotiate. He was wrong. The North did not want a negotiation. They wanted a coronation. Washington finally pulled the plug. The U.S. Congress voted down the additional aid. There would be no $700 million. There would be no B-52s. The lifeline was cut. When the news reached the embassy, Martin seemed to shrink. The energy that had sustained his denial began to leak away, replaced by a bitter, hollow exhaustion. He had gambled everything on the American political system, and it had rejected him. Yet even then, he refused to give the order everyone was waiting for. The word evacuation remained banned. The tamarind tree stood tall and untouched in the courtyard, mocking the pilots who eyed it nervously. While the ambassador remained frozen in his fortress of denial, the junior officers in the embassy began to take matters into their own hands. It was a mutiny of conscience. Men like Frank Snepp and other CIA analysts began forging documents. They began creating black flights. They smuggled their Vietnamese friends onto cargo planes under false pretenses. They drove people to the airport in the trunks of cars. They were saving lives by defying their own ambassador. The atmosphere in Saigon became surreal. The curfew was tightened. The streets were filled with the smoke of burning papers as the Vietnamese began to destroy any evidence of their connection to the Americans. The rich tried to buy boat passage, the poor prayed in the temples, and in the center of it all, in the white fortress of the embassy, Graham Martin moved like a sleepwalker through the corridors. He was coughing up blood again. He barely slept. He was a man watching the structure of his world dissolve brick by brick. He still believed against all evidence, against all logic, that he could pull one last rabbit out of the hat. He did not know that the time for magic was over, the time for the smoking gun, the final irrefutable act of negligence, was fast approaching. The 24 hours that would define his legacy and seal the fate of thousands were about to begin. The end of the Vietnam War did not arrive with a bang, but with a strange, suffocating humidity. By the morning of April 28th, Saigon was a city trapped under glass. The heat was oppressive. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the coming monsoon rains that would never arrive in time to slow the tanks. Graham Martin woke that morning believing he had finally engineered his miracle. In the presidential palace, a ceremony was taking place. General Duong Van Minh, known as Big Min, was being sworn in as the new president. Big Min was a neutralist, a man the communists had once hinted they could work with. Martin was convinced that this inauguration was the key. He believed that once Big Min took power, Hanoi would halt its tanks. He believed the third force had arrived. It was the final, most dangerous hallucination of the war. While the champagne was being poured in the palace, nature and war conspired to shatter the illusion. A sudden, violent thunderstorm broke over Saigon. Rain lashed the streets. Thunder shook the windows, and then mixed with the thunder came a sound that froze the blood of every veteran in the city. Jet engines. 3 A-37 Dragonflies. American-made jets captured by the North shrieked out of the clouds. They were flown by North Vietnamese pilots. They didn't target the palace. They targeted Tan Son Nhut Air Base. The bombs fell with precise, terrifying fury. The runways, the lifelines of the evacuation erupted in geysers of concrete and earth. In the embassy, the ground shook. The teacups rattled in their saucers. The message was unmistakable. The North Vietnamese were not interested in big men. They were not interested in diplomacy. They were closing the door. Yet Graham Martin's reaction defied all reason. When the reports came in that the airport had been bombed, he refused to accept that the fixed-wing evacuation was over. He argued that the damage was repairable. He insisted that the C-130 transports could still land. He was so consumed by his denial that he did something reckless. He got into his limousine and ordered his driver to take him to the airport. He wanted to see the craters himself. He drove through the chaotic streets, past the panic, past the checkpoints, to the burning airfield. He looked at the wreckage. He saw the smoke. And incredibly, he returned to the embassy and messaged Washington that the evacuation by plane could continue. This was the smoking gun. This specific moment of delay was the point where tragedy turned into crime. Every hour Martin spent arguing that the airport was open was an hour lost. The military attachés, General Homer Smith, knew the truth. They knew that once the runways were gone, the only option left was helicopters. And the math was brutal. A C-130 could carry 150, maybe 200 people. A helicopter could carry 50. Moving to a helicopter-only evacuation meant slashing the number of evacuees by 70%. It meant sentencing thousands of people to be left behind. General Smith pleaded with Martin, "Mr. Ambassador, we must go to option 4. We must use the helicopters. We must cut the tree." The tamarind tree. It was still there. Standing in the courtyard, blocking the landing zone for the heavy CH-53C stallions. Martin's face hardened. "The tree stays," he rasped. "To cut the tree is to signal defeat. I will not have it." Night fell on April 28th. The city was dark, but the horizon was lit by the muzzle flashes of the approaching army. The North Vietnamese had moved their heavy artillery into range. They were at the gates. At 4 a.m. on April 29th, the shelling began in earnest. It was a barrage of terrifying intensity. Rockets and 130-millimeter artillery shells slammed into Tan Son Nhut. The earth heaved. 2 young Marines, Darwin Judge and Charles McMahon, standing guard at the airport gate, were killed instantly. They were the last American ground casualties of the war. The phone rang in Martin's bedroom. It was General Smith. "The airport is under rocket fire," Smith shouted. "The runway is blocked with debris. A C-130 is burning on the tarmac. Fixed-wing operations are impossible. We have to go to the helicopters. Now." Martin, waking from his fitful sleep, still resisted. "Are you sure, General?" he asked. "Maybe we can patch the runway?" "Mr. Ambassador," Smith replied, his voice shaking with frustration, "the runway is dead." It took another 6 hours, 6 precious blood-soaked hours, for Martin to finally relent. He demanded to go to the airport again. He demanded more proof. It was an agonizing display of paralysis. He was a man holding a ticking bomb, arguing about the color of the wire. Finally, just before noon on April 29th, the order came from the White House. President Gerald Ford, tired of the delays, issued the command: execute Operation Frequent Wind. The sky over the South China Sea filled with the swarm of rotor blades. The U.S. Navy's Task Force 76 launched the fleet. The helicopters were coming. And now the consequences of the tree became a physical reality. Because the tree was still standing, the first wave of Marines landing at the embassy could not bring in the heavy equipment. They had to land on the roof. The courtyard, the main extraction point, was useless. The scene that followed was one of frantic, sweaty desperation. Marines, stripped to the waist in the sweltering heat, attacked the tamarind tree with axes and chainsaws. The symbol of Martin's resolve was hacked apart in a frenzy of wood chips and gasoline fumes. It took valuable time, time that they did not have. While they hacked at the tree, the word spread through Saigon. The Americans are leaving. The city convulsed. It wasn't just a panic. It was a tidal wave of human terror. Thousands of people rushed the U.S. Embassy. They arrived on scooters, in cars, on foot. They pressed against the high white walls. They were the people Polgar had wanted to evacuate weeks ago. The translators, the spies, the maids, the drivers, they waved their papers, they screamed names, they held up babies. Inside the compound, the incinerators on the roof failed. There was too much paper to burn. The classified history of the war, the names of the informants, the strategic assessments, it was all being stuffed into plastic bags and hauled to the courtyard to be burned in open barrels. The air turned black with the ash of secrets. Graham Martin stood in his office window, looking down at the mob. The smoke from the burning documents drifted up, obscuring his view. He looked frail, almost ghostly. He had forbidden the panic, and now he was drowning in it. He had waited too long. The airport was gone. The planes were gone. The third force was a myth. All that was left was the sound of the approaching rotors and the screams of the people he had sworn to protect, now pressing their faces against the cold iron bars of the embassy gate. The sleepwalker was finally awake, but he had woken up in hell. The afternoon of April 29th was not measured in hours, but in rotor rotations. The sky over Saigon had turned into a mechanical swarm. The first heavy CH-53C stallions, the Jolly Green Giants, descended from the clouds like prehistoric birds. They kicked up a blinding storm of dust, grit, and dried leaves. The wind from their blades flattened the grass in the embassy courtyard, whipping the faces of the thousands huddled there. The tamarind tree was finally gone. Its stump, jagged and white, stuck out of the earth like a broken bone, a monument to the time that had been squandered. The noise was deafening. It was a physical assault on the senses. The whop, whop, whop of the engines, the screaming of the jet turbines, the shouting of the Marines, and the wailing of the crowd outside the walls merged into a single, continuous roar of collapse. Inside the compound, the swimming pool, once the site of diplomatic cocktail parties and lazy Sunday afternoons, became the center of the world. It was the holding area. Thousands of people were packed around its edges. High-ranking generals, cabinet ministers, bar girls, maids, and spies stood shoulder to shoulder. The water in the pool was dirty, filled with debris and discarded weapons. Pistols, rifles, and uniforms were thrown into the blue water as men stripped off the symbols of their allegiance to a dying state. Graham Martin moved through this bedlam with a terrifying manic energy. The paralysis of the previous weeks had vanished, replaced by a desperate, frantic need to save bodies. He stood by the landing zone, his silver hair blowing in the rotor wash, gripping his briefcase. He was no longer the diplomat. He was the gatekeeper. He grabbed people. He shoved them toward the ramps of the helicopters. He argued with the pilots. "One more," he would shout over the roar. "Take one more." The pilots were exhausted. They had been flying for hours without rest, dodging anti-aircraft fire on the approach. They calculated weight and fuel with terrified precision. "Mr. Ambassador, we are full. We can't lift." But Martin pushed. He was trying to balance the ledger. He was trying to atone for the months of denial in a single afternoon of salvation. Every soul he stuffed into a helicopter was a victory against the ghost of his son. But for every person who made it onto a bird, 10 were left screaming at the gates. The scenes at the embassy walls were the most shameful in American military history. The Marine Guards, young men of 19 and 20, were ordered to hold the line. They looked down into the sea of faces, faces they knew. These were the people who had cooked their meals, washed their laundry, and fought alongside them. "Let me in. Please let me in." The cries came in English, in Vietnamese, in French. Hands reached through the iron bars, clutching wads of cash, gold bars, and letters of recommendation from U.S. officials. Mothers threw their babies over the razor wire, hoping someone on the other side would catch them. The Marines had to harden their hearts. They used their rifle butts to smash the fingers of those trying to climb over. They kicked people off the walls. They sprayed mace. One Marine later recalled looking into the eyes of a Vietnamese colonel he had worked with for a year. The colonel was begging. The Marine had to push him back into the crowd. The shame of that moment would haunt those young men for the rest of their lives. While the human drama played out at the walls, a silent intellectual tragedy was unfolding on the roof. The incinerators had failed. The embassy had a massive furnace on the roof designed to burn classified documents in an emergency, but the volume of paper was too great. Decades of intelligence, the entire bureaucratic memory of the war, could not be turned to ash in a few hours. The furnace overheated and broke down. The staff resorted to primitive measures. They hauled bags of documents to the courtyard. They smashed open the cabinets. They started bonfires in oil drums. But it was futile. The wind from the helicopters blew the unburned paper everywhere. Classified dossiers fluttered through the air like confetti. Top-secret memos landed in the streets outside, where the Viet Cong agents were already watching. And then the ultimate negligence. In the chaos, entire rooms of files were simply abandoned. The list that Thomas Polgar had agonized over. The names of the Phoenix program operatives, The names of the Vietnamese who had infiltrated the communist ranks. The names of the innocent civilians who had secretly helped the CIA Graham Martin's refusal to evacuate the files weeks earlier meant there was no time to destroy them now. They were left in their cabinets. They were left on desks. When the North Vietnamese intelligence officers entered the building the next day, they did not find ashes. They found a directory. They found a guest list for the executioners. It was a treasure trove of vengeance. Because of Martin's denial, the blood debt he feared so much was paid not by him, but by the thousands of loyal allies whose names were left waiting in the dark. Night fell, but the evacuation did not stop. The helicopters continued to land, their landing lights cutting through the smoke. The tracers from the North Vietnamese anti-aircraft guns stitched the sky with green and red lines. The perimeter was shrinking. The crowd at the gate was not thinning, it was growing. Martin stayed. He refused to leave. Washington was radioing him. "The president wants you out. The evacuation is ending." Martin lied. He radioed back, "I have a few hundred more. Send more birds." He was stalling. He knew that the moment he stepped onto a helicopter, the airlift would end. He knew that the moment the American flag came down, the people left in the courtyard, the Koreans, the Filipinos, the Vietnamese who had made it inside, would be abandoned. He was trying to hold back the dawn. He was trying to buy time with his own life. He stood there, a frail, coughing old man, defying the President of the United States, defying the North Vietnamese army, defying reality itself. He wanted to stay until the last person was out. But reality is a force that cannot be bargained with. The pilots were reaching their breaking point. The sun was preparing to rise on a new country, and the order from the White House became absolute, terrifyingly final. Tiger, tiger, tiger. The code rang out over the radio. It was the signal. The ambassador must be extracted. No more delays, no more excuses. The time for the sleepwalker to wake up and leave the burning house had finally arrived. The clocks in Saigon ticked past midnight, ushering in April 30th, the day of the fall. On the roof of the embassy, the world had shrunk to a small square of concrete, illuminated by the red glow of landing lights and the distant flickering horizon of a city on fire. The air smelled of aviation fuel, burning paper, and tear gas. Graham Martin was no longer a diplomat. He was a specter. He had spent the last 18 hours in a state of frantic atonement, moving through the embassy like a man possessed, trying to stuff the entire population of South Vietnam into the belly of a helicopter. He looked terrible. His skin was the color of wet ash. His eyes were sunken, rimmed with red, burning with a feverish exhaustion. He was running on caffeine, nicotine, and a terrifying refusal to let go. The pilots were done. They had been flying for nearly 20 hours straight. They were dodging surface-to-air missiles. They were landing on a roof that was slick with oil and rain. Captain Jerry Berry, the pilot of a CH-46 Sea Knight call-signed Lady Ace 09, had been circling the embassy for hours. He had a specific order from the White House, relayed through the insistent voice of the president himself. Get the ambassador. Berry landed his bird on the roof at 4:58 a.m. The rotors screamed, whipping the smoke into a frenzy. He sent a message to the Marines. I am not leaving without the ambassador. If he doesn't get on, I am shutting down the engines and I am coming down to get him. The message was clear. The United States was done. The patience of the superpower had run out. Down in his office, Graham Martin heard the ultimatum. He looked around the room. It was a wreck. Papers were scattered everywhere. The photos of his predecessors watched him from the walls. He looked at the window where the faces of the Vietnamese, his allies, his staff, the people he had sworn to protect, were still pressed against the glass, waiting for their turn. He knew. He knew that the moment he stepped out of that room, The bridge would be cut. Slowly, with the movements of a man walking to the gallows, he picked up two things. First, the American flag, which had been folded into a tight triangle. Second, his battered briefcase. He walked out of the office. He took the elevator to the roof. The walk up the final steel staircase was the longest journey of his life. He moved slowly, his frail body struggling against the wind of the rotors. The Marines helped him. They guided the sleepwalker toward the open ramp of the helicopter. He paused for a second. He looked back. He didn't see the geopolitical strategy. He didn't see the domino theory. He saw the faces in the courtyard below. 420 people were still there. They were looking up. They saw the ambassador. They saw the helicopter. And in that instant, they understood. They were not the lucky ones. They were the leftovers. Martin stepped onto the ramp. The Marine gunner pulled him inside. The ramp closed. At 5 a.m., Lady Ace-09 lifted off. As the helicopter banked sharply to avoid enemy fire, Graham Martin looked out of the small porthole. Below him, Saigon was a map of tragedy. The ammunition dumps at Long Binh were exploding, sending mushroom clouds of fire into the night. The headlights of the North Vietnamese tanks were visible on the highway, a river of steel flowing into the city. The fires in the embassy courtyard flickered like dying candles. He sat in the dark belly of the machine, clutching the folded flag on his lap. He did not speak. He did not look at the crew. He took a cigarette from his pocket, his hands shaking violently, and lit it. The smoke filled the cabin, mixing with the smell of sweat and fear. Back at the embassy, the moment Martin left, the reality shifted instantly. The remaining Marines, the rear guard, began their final retreat. They abandoned the perimeter walls. They fell back into the Chancery building. They locked the heavy teak doors. They retreated up the stairs, locking the grill gates behind them floor by floor. The crowd in the courtyard realized what was happening. A sound rose up, a collective wail of pure, distilled terror. They rushed the doors. They smashed the glass. They surged into the lobby. The Marines on the roof threw tear gas canisters down the stairwells to slow the mob. The gas drifted through the corridors, choking the people who had spent years serving the Americans. The translators, the secretaries, the intelligence assets, they were now coughing, blinding, stumbling in the dark, trapped between the locked gates and the approaching communist army. Graham Martin was gone. He was flying over the South China Sea, heading toward the safety of the USS Blue Ridge. He was safe. But he had left his soul back there, in the tear gas-filled stairwell, with the people who were now waiting for the tanks to crash through the gates. The sleepwalker had finally woken up, but he had woken up alone, leaving a legacy of ashes behind him. The blades of Lady Ace-09 finally stopped spinning on the flight deck of the USS Blue Ridge in the South China Sea. The silence that followed was heavier than the roar of the engines. Graham Martin stepped out of the helicopter. He was a broken man. He was suffering from advanced pneumonia, his lungs filled with fluid and the smoke of a burning city. He could barely walk. He looked like a refugee from a nightmare, his suit rumpled, his face a mask of gray exhaustion. He did not speak to the sailors who helped him. He did not ask about the war. He asked for a cigarette. Then he went below deck, collapsed into a bunk, and slept the sleep of the dead. Back in Saigon, the sun was high in the sky. It was April 30th. At the embassy, the final act of the tragedy was playing out. The last 11 Marines, the rear guard who had held the roof, were lifted off at 7:53 a.m. As their helicopter banked away, they dropped tear gas grenades onto the roof to discourage the crowd from grabbing the skids. The Americans were gone. For the hundreds of people left in the courtyard, the silence was terrifying. They waited. They looked at the sky, praying for one more bird, but the sky was empty. At 11:30 a.m., the end arrived. It didn't come from the sky, it came from the street. Tank number 390, a North Vietnamese T-54, smashed through the wrought iron gates of the presidential palace. Minutes later, soldiers in pith helmets, carrying AK-47s, walked into the U.S. Embassy compound. They did not storm it. They simply walked in. They walked past the smoldering barrels of unburned documents. They walked past the stump of the tamarind tree. They walked past the terrified civilians huddled by the swimming pool. They entered the Chancery building. They found the office of the ambassador. It was a looted shell, but on the floor, on the desks, and in the open safes, they found the treasure, the files. Because of the delay, because of the denial, the intelligence network of the United States was laid bare. The North Vietnamese intelligence officers spent weeks sifting through the papers Graham Martin had refused to burn. They compiled lists. In the months that followed, a darkness descended on South Vietnam. It was the darkness of the re-education camps. Hundreds of thousands of former soldiers, officials, and embassy employees were rounded up. Many were on the lists found in the embassy. They were sent to the jungle to clear minefields, to starve, and to die. Graham Martin, safe in America, faced a different kind of tribunal. He was not greeted as a hero. He was greeted as the architect of a humiliation. The press tore him apart. They called him the man who lost Saigon. They published the photos of the chaos, the looting, the desperate people at the wall, and they laid it all at his feet. Martin was defiant. He refused to apologize in his testimony before Congress, and in the few interviews he gave before retreating into obscurity, he stuck to his narrative. "I bought time," he insisted. He argued that by refusing to panic, he had allowed the evacuation to continue for weeks longer than the military had wanted. He claimed that if he had started the evacuation sooner, the South Vietnamese government would have collapsed in March, and no one would have gotten out. It was a seductive argument. It was the argument of a man trying to salvage his dignity. But history is a cruel accountant. The time he bought was purchased with the lives of the people he abandoned. By waiting until the airport was destroyed, he forced the evacuation into the bottleneck of the helicopters. By refusing to organize a sea lift, he left tens of thousands behind who could have been saved. He retired to North Carolina, the mountains of his youth. He lived quietly, a ghost in his own country. He died in March 1990. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. In a final poetic irony, his grave is located not far from the grave of his son, Glenn. The father and the son reunited in the earth, the war finally over for both of them. When we look back at the Fall of Saigon 50 years later, it is easy to focus on the geopolitics. We talk about the Cold War, the containment strategy, the failure of the American military machine. But the story of Graham Martin forces us to look at something far more uncomfortable, the fragility of the human mind. Graham Martin was not a villain in the traditional sense. He was not corrupt. He was not a coward. He was a man of immense will and fierce patriotism. But he was a man crippled by grief. He wanted to believe that his son's death had meaning, and that need to believe, that desperate, clawing need to find purpose in tragedy, blinded him to the reality of the world. He constructed a fortress of denial, and he locked himself inside it. He thought he was holding up the sky. He thought that if he just stood firm, if he just refused to accept defeat, he could bend history to his will. But history does not care about our grief. It does not care about our honor. It is a machine of cause and effect. The lesson of Graham Martin is a terrifying one. It teaches us that the most dangerous lies are not the ones we tell our enemies. They are not the ones we tell our voters. The most dangerous lies are the ones We tell ourselves to survive the night because eventually the sun rises. Eventually the tanks arrive. Eventually the helicopter leaves. And when the noise fades, all that is left is the silence of the empty room, the unburned files, and the stump of a tree that was cut down too late. The sleepwalker finally woke up, but by then the house was already ashes.